Thank you guys very much for coming to our presentation, Exploring the Motivations of Undergraduate Sport Management Students by Tyler Hajek, Kyle Brannigan, and Dr. Brent D. OJ. So first, I just want to go over a quick plan of action for our presentation today. First, I'll get into the introduction and purpose, the literature review, and then Tyler will take over going over the methods, results, the discussion and practical takeaways, and we'll end up with some of our limitations and room for future research. First, as mentioned, the introduction and purpose. So term enrollment has decreased from fall of 2015 to spring of 2019. So obviously there's a reason for this drop off. And if we can figure out the motivation factors behind students, hopefully we can stop this gap of fall off, if you will. Understanding student motivation is of interest to not only educators and the lower ranks, but also us as academics and in the higher education as well, because obviously these sport management students are hoping to go on and move into the industry and be able to work in the industry. And we need to know what motivates them to be able to get to that point. So understanding student motivation is not only of interest to teachers, but also student motivation research is diverse and very complex. So being able to narrow it down to just our field can hopefully figure out the answers that we need to know for the students that are going to be in our actual field. Specifically, we explored what intrinsically and extrinsically motivates students to enroll in sport management, again, hoping to be able to find these answers for students in our particular field. So now I want to go over the review of literature. So first, the first sport management courses started all the way back in the 1950s. However, now in 2019, we have over 400 campuses in the United States that offer a bachelor degree in sport management, and that is continuing to grow. Now, sport management majors have a difficult time landing employment within the sport management field. So as I had mentioned in the previous slide, it's really important to us to be able to figure out what motivates these students and hopefully not only end the drop off in the amount of students going into our major, but also end the drop off of the amount of students that can't land jobs once they do finish up at our institutions. Now the review of literature continued. Academics, researchers, universities, and professors have a vested interest in determining what motivates students. Obviously, as educators, we want to know what is going to get these students up every single day to want to come to classes, to want to learn what they need to learn to be able to actually land jobs in the industry. Real world motivation has been found to be an important concern for teachers and leaders and is a valuable skill to be able to create. So we can figure out how to better motivate these students and what is motivating them. Again, hopefully we will be able to close the gap in the amount of people that are coming into our programs and be able to also get them industry jobs. So the theory that we are using for this study is the self-determination theory. Common concepts associated with SDT or self-determination theory are intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, as well as aid motivation. And we will get into the explanations of those in a little bit here. But students tend to pursue things they think will ultimately lead to need satisfaction. And SDT may allow researchers a different approach to motivation by being able to discover what type of motivation is being exhibited by a person at a certain time, i.e. whether it be extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivation, or aid motivation. So first, extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is motivation to know, it's motivation to accomplish, and it's motivation for stimulation. Intrinsic motivation has shown to have a positive contribution to both quality of learning and the overall experience. Now, extrinsic motivation is external regulation, introjected regulation, and identified regulation. It's more of, you want possibly they want their parents or their friends to know that they were able to get this degree and have this type of accomplishment. It's more about maybe for other people opposed to being able to actually doing it yourself and wanting to learn and wanting to actually maybe work in the sport industry. So those would be the difference between the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations.
To add to what Kyle had been describing, motivation can be best conceptualized on a spectrum. So, starting with amotivation, so the lowest form of motivation in which it's basically non existent, leads into external regulation in which more monetary awards are provided and quid pro quo. If you do this for me, I'll do this for you. leading into introjective motivation, where you begin to have more of the societal peer level review as far as being recognized for performance, ultimately leading to identified motivation, which is getting closer to intrinsic motivation, in which there is that social identification that I'm a part of something, I'm a part of a team, and ultimately trying to get to an integrated level of motivation where the extrinsic and intrinsic motivations collide, in that, again, that intrinsic is that internal drive. So put best by Pittsburgh Steelers former coach Chuck Noll, the mercenaries will always beat the draftees, but the volunteers will crush them both. So those that are there voluntarily will ultimately outperform based on his standard those that are involuntarily in a position. With SDT in mind, our two research questions are focused on the two types of motivation. So, how exactly are sport management undergraduate students experiencing intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation? We incorporated sequential explanatory design, in which we took a quantitative approach first before enlisting the qualitative side, in which we distributed an online survey via Qualtrics, and we utilized the academic motivation scale, which the questions we tailored more so to sport management versus just overall academic interest. And there was 28 items with the 7 subscales, and they ultimately tied up together to make one overall score based on the 3 types of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and then a motivation as a reverse variable, just to ensure that students weren't just filling out the survey quickly without even reading the responses. And we also included the student engagement scale just to see the overall engagement of these students from a variety of perspectives, in which their interactions with faculty, fellow students, their academic coursework, as well as extracurriculars. And once they completed the survey, they had an opportunity to sign up for a voluntary semi-structured interview, in which we want to get a qualitative approach to that, and we utilize thematic analysis to elicit themes and ultimately code transcribe to get to those themes. With the results, we reached 29 online survey participants, in which 4 of those culminated into interviews of undergraduate students enrolled in sport management programs. And with the overall findings, before we go to the motivation by motivation breakdown, overall intrinsic motivation was a bit less than overall extrinsic motivation, again with the 3 subscales per motivation. But what was reassuring to see was the A motivation scores were relatively low, so it wasn't as if that was also at that 4-point level, in which the academic motivation scale, that was on a 7-point Likert scale, and then the engagement scale was on a 6-point scale. Breaking down intrinsic motivation, overall, the highest motivation subscale was to know. So these are example questions. Because I experienced pleasure and satisfaction while learning new things in sport is why I chose sport management, as well as the pleasure I experienced in broadening my knowledge in sport, as well as my studies allow me to do so and explore things that interest me, followed by accomplishment and stimulation. As far as extrinsic motivation breakdown, identified was the highest, and there was a little bit less separation between the other extrinsic forms of motivation, whereas the identified sub questions were that this will help me make a better choice as far as what I want to do a career in, trying to orient it to sport, as well as I think a college education will assist me get to where I want to go. And with the external regulation, that's more so I'm pursuing this degree so I can have a better salary later on and have the quote unquote good life by completing this degree. To close out the quantitative descriptive statistics, student engagement, so hovered around right around that 3-point, that middle echelon of the 6-point Likert scale, whereas academic was highest, so how often they worked on larger papers, followed by interaction with classmates, how often did they talk to their classmates about career opportunities, course content, followed by interaction with the faculty, like seeking out that mentorship as well as career advice, and then finally extracurricular activities. So how often are they engaging in things that are not directly tied to their sport management discipline? From there, we explored correlations between the engagement and motivation metrics, in which academic engagement was statistically significant with intrinsic motivation. All three forms were significant for those that indicated high levels of engagement with their academic side tied to sport management, as well as the motivation types themselves all had at least one form of motivation between extrinsic and intrinsic that were largely correlated. And then identification in particular was significant with all three types of intrinsic motivation. And finally, amotivation, the seventh subscale of that adapted AMS, was not correlated with any motivation or engagement type, which was reassuring to see that there weren't high levels of motivation and also a correlated high level of not being motivated. And now we'll get into the qualitative portion of the study, in which we pulled out themes from the conversations we had with 4 of the interviewees with pseudonyms provided: Alex, Carl, Bailey, and Greg, in which this might be a simple answer, but doesn't mean it's incorrect, that at least for Kyle and I, we can attest that we're here because of our experiences and meaningful experiences tied to sport. And each of the participants indicated some level of love or fondness for the experience tied to sport, whether it was their playing career in undergraduate or even high school or middle school. But just sport in and of itself is worth it for these individuals, why they're pursuing the degree. And with the degree, this ties a bit more to extrinsic motivation for identification, that they see the need for their own career, why the sport management degree works for them to help them align more so to a career that they desire. While the overall engagement scores on the quantitative side were relatively low, engagement still existed among the 4 participants, and Bailey ultimately suggested that she takes the time to talk to one of her classmates routinely about their internship experience as well as course content, and on a more as needed basis take the time to talk to faculty and develop those mentorship relationship, where I imagine that probably occurs more on the graduate side of sport management programs. And then finally, gaining knowledge. So that ties more so to intrinsic motivation, to know that they're just enjoying the process, enjoying learning the new things tied to sport management and being a part of the trends. And they understand that the experience is necessary, and through that experience are gaining further knowledge into aspects of sport. And some of these participants even suggested that they are looking potentially for graduate experience, a master's program or an internship fellowship following their time as undergraduate students at their respective university or college. Finally, among the themes is just understanding that the decision the students have made, in which they're not necessarily there for the extrinsic parts of it, that there isn't the quick tie to money or getting out of debt sooner, and they tie it back to more of that identification piece, that bridge of extrinsic intrinsic motivation, and that it's not necessarily about the accolades or the money. It's they want to be a part of something larger than themselves, larger than just the bottom line. That sport innately matters to them, and they want to be a part of it and have it be a facilitator of their career and aspirations. With the quantitative and qualitative approaches to the study covered, we are now headed to the discussion, in which, again, we wanted to reiterate that the overall average for extrinsic motivation was higher for intrinsic motivation, just based on the quantitative averages. But those students that did respond to the semi-structured interview portion of the study really identified through their programs, hence the extrinsic identified form of motivation. But that's a kind of a bridge between extrinsic, strictly, I'm here for the money, I'm here for some other outside influence, rather than the innate enjoyment. So, again, that number just might be a little bit confusing, but ultimately, both forms or motivations were experienced by the participants. So, those students that might have reached out to complete the semi structured were more internally, intrinsically motivated. And interestingly enough, that the academically engaged students were correlated with all three types of intrinsic types of motivations, which makes sense with their more higher levels of activity in the classroom and in their discipline ultimately led to higher levels of intrinsic types of motivations, where potentially those that were less engaged academically may have had lower levels of intrinsic motivation, potentially higher level of extrinsic motivation, and hopefully not amotivated. So, what exactly can we use this information and ultimately build on it as academics in the field? Here are some practical takeaways. Students ultimately identified with sport and subsequently their respective programs, that they may have started out in a college of business, which 3 of the 4 participants indicated, all 4 indicated they were in a different program, but something within them, whether it was their experience as well as even just watching sports just for the enjoyment of it, that's how they identified with their respective programs. And while these were largely more generalized on the quantitative end for having higher identified scores extrinsically and intrinsic motivation to know more, gain more knowledge about sport, that each student has their own individual motivations, as we didn't get an opportunity to ask each of the participants on the quantitative portion through the qualitative portion. And that's ultimately what we want to take away, is that each student has their own drivers for why they're here. And if there's some way we can tap into that, whether that's a survey at the beginning of the semester or just having a check-in partway through the semester just to see how things are going, and I think that could pay long dividends as far as ensuring students are engaged throughout the whole process, where I know there will still be those students that check in day one and then check in the last day of the semester. But as we know, with COVID-19, the pandemic, along with having personal issues arise in your life, there's just some things that might take precedence in a given moment. So just to be understanding in that sense, as well as being able to convey things that interest these students and add to their engagement and facilitating things that drive their motivation. And the portion that we provided for you today is a part of a larger study that we are continuing to work on following this presentation. And again, we ultimately want to be able to best convey lessons in sport and trends of the industry to these students that Kyle and I have taught on more of an individual class by class basis, as well as adjunct roles, that in more consistent full-time roles that we get to see these students time and time again versus a one-off semester situation, that develop the type of mentorship, engagement, and other facets of the program. Again, having multiple perspectives from a variety of professors, instructors is beneficial, but at the same time, the rapport and mentorship doesn't necessarily take hold in a 15 to 16 week semester, that we have that continuity as well. This study was not without limitations and opportunities for future research, in which COVID-19 played a role in how we were able to access the student population, which ultimately facilitated the responses for the interviews that may have been more intrinsic themselves. So having the opportunity to get in the classroom and get responsive for all types of students. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today. If you have any questions or feedback, don't hesitate to reach out, and references are available upon request.
Yep. Thank you very much for tuning in to our presentation and for listening. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact myself or Tyler Hajek. Thank you all very much and enjoy the conference.